Borodar, good morning and welcome to the first webinar in our series, Ways Forward, Evidence and Insights for the Next Welsh Government. My name is Dan Bristow. I'm the Director of the Wales Centre for Public Policy. The WCPP is an independent research centre based at Cardiff University, and we work to bridge the gap between research and decision-making by making rigorous evidence and expertise accessible, relevant and actionable for decision makers across Wales. And for this webinar series, we're glad to be partnering with the IWA. The IWA is an independent think tank, charity and membership organisation. They produce agenda-setting research and policy on Wales's economy and democracy and provide platforms for informed debate, including through their events and in-house current affairs magazine, The Welsh Agenda. Before we get going in earnest, I've got a few housekeeping notices. As a webinar on Zoom, participants have been muted, but there is going to be an opportunity for you to ask questions. We're using the Q&A function, so have a look at the bottom of your screen and get thinking about your questions now. We also encourage you to use the chat function to introduce yourselves and engage with each other. And if you want to share your email and enable other people to get in contact with you, other attendees to get in contact with you, please feel free to do so. Final bit of housekeeping, just to remember that all chat and questions are being recorded, and we're going to be sharing a recording of today's event via both the IWA and WCPP websites and YouTube channels. So that's the housekeeping done. You'll be pleased to hear. So why have we decided to do this webinar series? Our aim with this series is to look at some of the challenges that await the next Welsh Government and to bring together evidence and expert insight to stimulate conversations about the key questions and potential ways forward. This first webinar is focused on exploring how efforts to tackle climate change might also strengthen local communities and economies across Wales. We know that a key challenge for policymakers in the next Welsh Government will be how to support economic growth and development and to address the cost of living crisis. Economic development is also uneven across Wales. Parts of the country have high rates of poverty, where other areas have seen much stronger productivity and wage growth over the last few years. At the same time, there's an urgent need to tackle climate change. Wales's transition to net zero could be a major opportunity for local economies, allowing us to spread development and prosperity while reducing emissions and taking advantage of new technologies. To explore this topic, we've invited our speakers to respond to two questions. Firstly, how the net zero transition can maximise opportunities for localities and build on the existing strengths of local economies. And secondly, what this transition means for skills policy. What skills do we need to support businesses and communities to ensure that Wales makes the most of the opportunities afforded by the transition? I'm now going to invite each of our contributors to speak for a few minutes before opening it up for questions. First up is my colleague, Dr. Helen Tilley. Helen is the Director of Policy and Practice, leading the Centre's Welsh Government Work Programme, and she directs the Centre's Environment and Net Zero priority area, supporting the development and implementation of public policies on net zero, decarbonisation, skills and productivity and economic growth. Over to you, Helen.
Thanks, Dan. Borodar, it's a real pleasure to be here. Firstly, I'd like to kick us off by saying a few words about why we can't afford not to move towards net zero at a rapid pace. The next slide shows that there's a strong human health and nature and biodiversity argument. And the Natural Resources Wales report last week highlighted the life and death issues involved. As well as this, there's a really strong economic argument as well. As Dan mentioned, we've got a huge variation in productivity and economic performance in Wales, and this is reflected in the real wages of households. This reflects geography, and this is beyond the basic rural-urban split. Also in terms of transport links, demography, workforce characteristics and skills, industrial structure, and patterns of deindustrialisation. And these features are reflected again and again in the uneven development of investment and variation in other statistics, including productivity. And this is shown here as GVA per hour worked in the chart. And you can see that local areas with productivity levels higher than the Welsh average are clustered in North and South Wales. And these are shown as the top 4 areas on the chart. And this strong performance of some areas, of course, is great news, but the flip side of that is that there's many localities that have got lots of untapped potential, with the possibility of improvements in quality of life that aren't being realised. And decarbonising and moving towards net zero presents a huge economic opportunity, and it can generate immediate economic benefits by expanding sectors, creating jobs, and also good quality jobs, I should emphasise, and increasing energy security. And there's the potential for substantial investment and creating the sort of really productive, high quality jobs that we need. And this can also reduce economic inequalities if it's done well. In being cognizant of the spatial impacts of policies, it's also really important to not only avoid reinforcing past inequalities, but actively reduce inequalities between local areas and prioritise intersectional characteristics as well, such as race, gender, social class, to name a few. And in short, we need a diverse workforce to have a productive and innovative economy. And these tools are available to do this. There's been recent economic multiplier work to understand where economic gains are located and the wider supply chain impacts and how sectors interact. But these tools are only as good as the investment that's in the data that's put into them. So it really is essential that we invest in data to ensure that we get robust conclusions coming out that can inform policy. So well-designed just transition to net zero can build a stronger and more equal local economies, but it's urgent and we really need to move rapidly. I'm not suggesting a whirlwind, but rather a solid strategy that follows a steady path and that's grounded in evidence. And in this way, it can support investor confidence. So I'd stress that the key is decisive and committed action. So what are some of the priorities for the next Welsh Government? And the next slide shows some lessons drawing from our work. Our past projects have highlighted a number of common challenges, and these are on the left. It's urgent, it's a crisis, and it affects all areas. So we need skills in all areas, we need coordinated policies, and we need financing to address constrained capacity. And it's critical to tackle inequalities to realise the potential opportunities. Our work's also pointed to associated solutions on the right. Firstly, supporting investment in key sectors. Substantial investments needed, and this requires an associated consideration of the needs of communities as part of this. And stimulating demand and supply. So, for example, direct and indirect impacts on the supply chain or local area development. And a contract for offshore wind deployment, for example, has got a direct jobs impact and also creates more money and jobs in the supply chain as local residents sort of spend money in pubs, cafes, local shops, whatever they do, etc. And using digitalisation and AI will be a part of this. So both a part of this for the sectors and also as a tool, and also an important sector of investment as well. Education skills sector, skills system, coordination. Simplifying and clarifying the roles and responsibilities in the skills system, which hopefully the national skills audit that's forthcoming will do. And continuing coordination with MEDA and the regional skills partnerships. Labour market intelligence is a strategic asset to inform planning, and that's really important. Innovative financing. We've done some work with Welsh Local Government Association on local authorities moving towards net zero, and substantial gains can be made by looking at innovative financing and coordinating the capacity to manage it. And the plan needs to be a just transitions plan, as I've already mentioned, and the framework is there to build upon. And we need this because adaptation actions can have unequal effects. So cutting across all of these, there's the importance of responding to the needs of places, tailoring skills policies and other important policies that I haven't had time really to mention here, but including infrastructure, transport, business support, AI growth zones, for instance. And we've seen in areas like Port Talbot, this means reskilling, retraining, and support for local entrepreneurship. And the next slide, I've just highlighted some principles that underpin these solutions. Firstly, stressing stability, really important for providing confidence and guiding investment decisions of the private sector. So clear signalling by implementing a medium-term vision that sits within an overarching direction and narrative. In prioritising, focusing on the things where impacts are the largest so we can start to see the greatest possible change. And this is important given the urgency, and also to invoke a virtuous cycle. For example, we've just published a paper on domestic retrofit, a sector that faces high upfront costs, skills shortages, complex financing arrangements, and a high disruption factor for households. And here there's a potential for targeted large-scale investment to stimulate demand and supply by de-risking entry into that market. And that can create economies of scale and drive innovation further. And the next Welsh Government can achieve the most by pulling all of the available policy levers in a coordinated manner, so working across sectors, and the change will need to be all-encompassing for it to be impactful. And this requires clarifying roles and responsibilities. So I've already mentioned the coordination of bodies within the skills system, but there's also a need for coordination and the pooling of resources between local authorities, and corporate joint committees can play an important role in regional coordination. Use existing frameworks and tools. So we've got the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is a really important framework, and also developing the Just Transition framework into a medium-term plan. Of course, in the Wales Centre for Public Policy, being based there, it would be wrong if I didn't mention the importance of evidence. It's really important to understand the gaps, ensuring that policy is underpinned by strong evidence. And data and analytical capacity, I just want to stress, these are strategic assets for effective place-based net zero policy. And the investment in evidence is needed to inform policy decisions, so data, labour market intelligence, and identifying and filling research gaps. And finally, supporting regional mapping and the use of other tools, developing those tools, and then providing the evidence to support them. Thank you. I'll stop talking there.
Thanks, Helen. I mean, there's a lot in there, I think, reflecting the various and numerous pieces of work that we've done, kind of looking at these linked sets of issues. And so plenty for people to be pondering as they're thinking about the questions they might want to ask you and other panelists. I'm going to invite next Henry Richards to speak. Henry leads the British Academy's Sustainable Futures public policy work, drawing together humanities and social science research to explore the profound implications of the social, political, and economic systems we live in for environmental sustainability, and the challenges and solutions they provide to achieving a brighter future. Henry, over to you.
Thank you, Dan, and thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to be here and to hear some of the discussion and, of course, to contribute to it. So I'm really delighted to be able to share some of the findings from the British Academy's research that we present in our two recent reports. And I think if I get the next slide, they'll come up. Great, thanks. There they are. The first I'm going to talk about looks at place-sensitive approaches to policymaking, and the second looks at using good democratic governance to accelerate progress towards the net zero target. Both are critical for the question being posed today around the transition to net zero and how it contributes to local economies across Wales. So if I take the next slide. And just before I carry on, I'm going to stress, as Helen was, the importance of evidence here and to highlight that our work really builds on and draws from a wide range of other people's research, and we're very privileged to be able to do that. And so there's a quick overview on this slide. I'm not going to go into all of the details, but it's worth stressing that many researchers have worked on these issues for decades. And so there's a lot that we know, and the findings I'm presenting represent well-established insights into what has been shown to work. The next slide. I've tried to focus on, I think, the first question that's been posed to the webinar, and there's certainly a lot I could say from our findings, but I'm going to try and pick out 4 levers from across those 2 reports that I think have the potential to make a difference on this question. And so first I'll talk about our work on place sensitivity and pick out 2 levers, that's knowledge and language, and then I'll pick up on our work on good democratic governance around net zero and highlight 2 more, so collaborating with intermediaries and navigating just transitions. So on the next slide, first I'll talk about place sensitivity, and that this isn't just something for local government. I think it's worth emphasising that this is as much about how national government facilitates a supportive, enabling environment for policy design and delivery focused around places and at a place level. And I'm going to pick out 2 features of this approach that we explored, and those are knowledge and language. So our report explores all the ins and outs of both of these. I'm going to dip in very lightly and talk about a few of the headlines. On knowledge, I'm going to stress that this needs to be 2-way or even multi-directional. In other words, it's not just about national government communicating top-down, but also about creating means for knowledge to flow from communities, which includes businesses and organisations which often sit at the heart of those communities, and gets that knowledge flowing through to government. This tends to happen incidentally, but I think it's worth understanding it is a lever that can be used systematically, and that in that way valuable informal knowledge can more easily be transmitted and used in decision making. Next, I'm going to highlight language, and language sits absolutely at the heart of the many questions around environmental sustainability, and particularly questions on net zero. Increasing polarisation around the term net zero illustrates this, I think, very clearly. Now, net zero obviously is a crucial legal and technical target, as Helen was talking about earlier. But although community and local priorities don't necessarily relate on the surface to net zero, climate action can be delivered alongside priorities like addressing the cost of living, supporting thriving local economies, and reducing air pollution. So language sits at the heart of all of this, and it can be used as a lever that governments at all levels can use to give more consideration and build on relevant research to address the concerns of communities. Moving swiftly on, I want to just touch on a couple of aspects of our second report with the next slide, if that's okay. And I'm putting forward here for the discussion our work, as I said earlier, on good democratic governance around net zero. And we specifically looked at the conditions that would support speeding up action around net zero, given the urgency of the challenges we face. And I think one of the points the report tries to get across is that governance is sort of a double-edged sword. It can create frictions, but these can also be flipped, and done well, good democratic governance can speed up delivery even on a complex and long-term issue like net zero. So from this framework, I'm going to focus first on collaborating with intermediaries. And for local economies, this is particularly important. Intermediaries sit in the gaps between people, communities, business and government. They can be any one of those actors, and importantly, they form partnerships. They facilitate knowledge transfer, they foster buy-in, innovate locally appropriate pathways, generate resources and build confidence. But they often need a small amount of financial support and positive engagement from government to get going. So again, they represent another crucial lever. Finally, I'm going to say a little bit about navigating just transitions. And I think, as we've already heard, just transitions in Wales is defined by a new just transition framework. But I want to talk about the navigating part here. And our report gets into this in more depth. So navigating gets to the heart of the challenge for decarbonising sectors of the economy, including energy intensive industries, but also sectors crucial to local economies, such as farming and food production. Navigating just transitions means understanding and acknowledging the histories and power imbalances, bringing forward transparent approaches and then acting on this knowledge to find fair pathways for communities. It's not a straightforward area, but understanding that and building on that knowledge is, again, a lever that perhaps goes beyond the usual suspects, but therefore provides opportunities to move more quickly. Put together, these 4 levers, knowledge, language, collaborating with intermediaries and navigating just transitions, offer opportunities to find a way through a very challenging moment. But I think the good news is that there is a lot of insight and research on what works that local and national leaders can draw on, much of which I'm very pleased to say you can find referred to in our reports. I think that's all I've got time for, so I'm going to hand back to Dan there.
Thanks, Henry. That's really interesting and a good teaser for the work that underpins those reflections. So thank you very much for that. Next, I'm going to come to Ben Berggraff. Ben's the CEO at Net Zero Industry Wales, supporting the industrial clusters in Wales on their journey to net zero. A native of Netherlands, Ben moved to Wales in 2007 to work at Tata Steel in South Wales. And in 2014, he made the switch to Welsh Water, where he ultimately led on all aspects of energy and carbon management as their head of energy. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Dan, and thanks for having me here. I'm not working for Welsh Water anymore. I'm now working for Net Zero Industry Wales, as I said, and I have the pleasure of pulling together and helping to implement the very kind of ambitious cluster plans that have been developed over the last couple of years, particularly in the South Wales Industrial Cluster, as well as in the Northeast Wales Industrial Decarbonisation Cluster, NUITH, which covers Deeside and Wrexham, and both combined equate to 18 million tons of CO2, which is not far off 45% of the total carbon footprint of Wales. So what we want to do is frame those plans within the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and use that act as a North Star rather than a way of articulating what we don't want to see in Wales. And I think one of the key challenges we have, I think, particularly when we talk about place-based adequate solutions for decarbonisation provided that just transition, is to really articulate clearly to people, I think, about how those kind of like places can be defined within that act and actually develop that kind of balanced scorecards approach. So what we've been doing over the years, we've been tracking, but also developing a plan around how we would like to see industry decarbonise while still maintaining some form of productivity in Wales. And what you've seen has been significant reductions since 1990, but we shouldn't just celebrate that, because a lot of those emissions reductions have been achieved by deindustrialization, by producing less effectively. And I think across the UK, that's been quantified of over an impact of over 100 million tons of CO2 by the Climate Change Committee. And given that Wales has a strong manufacturing heritage, but also still manufactured quite a bit, but has lost quite a significant amount, a large part of that 100 million tons of CO2 is somewhere adequate across the world. And I think we need to be mindful of that we're not just putting our dirty linen and continue that kind of trend. So we developed a clear pathway, which you see in that also that link. The slides will be shared. And that's not only targeting adequate just carbon capture storage. So it looks at all the technology levers at our disposal. And you see there the breakdown all around from energy and resource efficiency, fuel switch to hydrogen, fuel switch to electrification, the ability to actually create some industrial symbiosis to clean growth hubs, as well as the adoption of carbon capture utilization and carbon capture storage to all play a role in delivery of that kind of ambitious plan. Next slide, please. Now, in order to make that opportunity reality, we developed that combined in combination with all of our public but also private sector stakeholders, a clear kind of plan with some strategic goals, and that centers around energy industries, and therefore it's really nicely aligned with one of the industrial strategy 8 kind of categories that the UK industrial strategy has identified. And that's all about actually producing more local, globally competitive, low carbon energy. But there's also still a role for fossil fuels in there. And I think we shouldn't forget that, particularly during the transition, but also post-transition, there is still a role of fossil fuels, where possibly that's abated. And if not abated, then we have negative emissions to compensate for that, because we do talk about net zero, not zero. And I think it's an important part of the story and often forgotten when we talk about net zero is that role of fossil fuel, particularly in that mix. Secondly, it's about energy infrastructure. We need to build significantly more infrastructure, particularly grid, but also hydrogen, carbon capture and storage infrastructure. But we also need to think about the impact that might have on water and actually ports and others. And I think that those elements are not always discussed in this kind of context. Last but not least, if we really want to benefit from that low carbon energy in the infrastructure, and also on an enduring basis, we need to also have still have an industry that can benefit from that low carbon energy to produce adequate low carbon and sustainable goods and services within Wales, and position Wales as a country that can do so. We've developed to support that 13 additional strategies, and there are also 20 plus anchor projects that have been identified to deliver these kind of goals in a collaborative way. Next step, please. Next slide, sorry. So we've brought it together in on a map, and that's been further strengthened by investment prospectus that we pulled together, which is effectively a gateway document which allows people to see the investment potential that's needed, which is available in Wales to deliver this. And you see here a big snapshot of all the energy and decarbonisation projects that are currently in development in Wales or currently in operation. And this is a significant kind of growth opportunity and investment associated with that. Now, people talk about skills. I think Helen was talking about it as well. What we saw from some of the work we've done within the cluster work is that actually a lot of the communities distrust these kind of pictures and these ambitions and values, because over the last 20, 30 years, since a lot of industries have closed, nothing has come back to replace them. And also the kind of Horizon Wilfa kind of story about training people up to help and actually physically deliver the Horizon project, the original one there, and actually then cancelling the project, and then those people having to leave their communities, has really shaped the local community's belief whether that actually is going to help a reality. So I'm a really true believer that actually skills development, the skills progress will have to go in conjunction with actual investment happening on the ground, so people can see and touch and feel some of these new facilities being built whilst we're also training up. And I think it needs to go in tandem. It cannot be that skills is developed before actual investment decisions are being made. So we need to be very careful with that, because otherwise we will start to create further distrust in this. Next slide. Now, there's a significant economic impact on that. We've done a lot of work on that to help inform the UK industrial strategy. There's a significant GVA impact directly through the investment of in low carbon energy across Wales, and there's a total GVA impact over 25 years of over 130 billion pounds, which is significant. But what you also can see, and there's an online B4 in the middle, that actually by generating that low carbon energy, you also retain more industries. And that has also combined impact of estimated of 46 billion. We haven't really explored the growth opportunity yet, because I think a lot of companies feel very, cautious of actually committing and actually showcasing the kind of numbers and of investment for further growth or expansion. So this is really only about retaining that economic impact. And in total, it has a significant impact on the economy in Wales. And I think it makes it very clear to people of the significant kind of relationship between the investment which I outlined and the economic impact. Last slide, please. That's, I think, for me, just to give you an ear up of what's happening within the kind of industrial sector and what's been done so far to help and further the kind of large industrial emissions and bring that to net zero over the last couple of years. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Really interesting, and some interesting points there about the relationship between kind of skills and skills pipelines, and also trust and sustaining trust in communities. I think hopefully we'll pick up some of that as we get into the discussion and the questions. The next person I want to invite to speak is Andy Regan. Andy leads Nesta's work in Wales with a particular focus on influencing devolved policy around Nesta's missions and promoting the use of applied innovation in policymaking. Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everyone. So I'm partly speaking with my current Nesta hat on. One of Nesta's missions, as Dan mentioned, is about clean heat in homes. There's lots of kind of skills opportunities within that, which I might come on to in a moment. But I'm also somebody who I've worked at the IWA in the past and various other roles in and around energy over the last 10 years. And I just wanted to kind of foreground something that I think is often kind of goes unsaid in these sort of discussions, which is basically Wales needs to decide whether it wants clean, cheap energy as soon as possible. If we look at what's going on in kind of energy bills at the moment, North Wales and Mersey has the most expensive energy in the UK. Standing charges are about 15 pence a day higher than the GB average, which is hundreds of pounds a year more for households. Unit rates are also higher in North Wales. South Wales is doing a bit better now than it has been, with slightly below average unit rates and standing charges, but we're still not in the position we could have been in. part of that is down to like Ben's obviously summarizing all the really good work that is going on in renewables. So there's lots of reasons to be optimistic. But if you look at the growth rate of renewables over time since 2014, the kind of growth in installed capacity in Wales peaked in 2014 with a 34% growth then. We added over a gigawatt of capacity in just over 2 years, but it's taken another decade since then to add just over another gigawatt and a half of capacity. And if you look at what the sort of the sector is calling for, aiming for just over kind of 17 gigawatts by 2035 is the target that some people are calling for. So whatever we're sort of thinking about in terms of a vision of Wales's future economy, any part of that is going to benefit from having cheaper energy right here. If you think about like what are the sectors of Wales economy where we're doing really well, they're not, this is not an exhausted list, but the screen sector, creative industries, tourism and hospitality, services, financial services, advanced manufacturing, food and drink. And if you envisage Wales having a future where we have loads of AI and fintech, whatever the next thing that Wales is going to try and grow its economy around, every single one of those things benefits from cheap energy. If you're running a small tourism business in North Wales and you're paying 15 pence a day more for whatever you're charging onto your customers, you're going to struggle. And it's frustrating as somebody who's been in and around the kind of policy debates in Wales, including the time at the IWA, that to Alan's point earlier, needing to be sort of decisive and committing to a particular direction. There's been a number of debates that in my view, have sort of slowed down the opportunity to make really fast progress towards cheaper, cleaner energy in Wales. Because it's not just a question of like, do we want it? It's when do we want it? And obviously we want it as soon as possible and probably could have had an advantage 10 years ago had we kind of moved forward. So there's been debates like the relative contribution of the community energy sector versus kind of large scale development. For what it's worth, would like to see the community energy sector play a really strong role in that. Very much agree with the IWA's position. I think perhaps Naomi will say a bit more about the detail of those opportunities, but just take it as read that that's something I really do support. But I think we've too often in Wales treated that debate as if the sort of a fixed amount of energy that could ever be generated, and those two sectors are kind of competing to do it, rather than from a policy perspective, looking at things that kind of unblock development, just being equally good for anyone, whether you're a large scale developer or a small scale developer. So I don't think it's helpful to see those two sectors as being at odds with each other. There are debates that are a lot harder to square off, things like, visual amenity, to use the Ofgem language, or the view out of people's windows, to use more normal language. That's really hard to square off. But to me, the question there is, have we been honest enough with people about quite how much more electrification there is going to need to be in the future if we're not going to essentially run out of clean energy, clean electricity for heat in Nesta's interest, and transport. Do people really have a sense of? I think people are still quite anchored on the idea that either you can have new energy infrastructure near me or you can have it somewhere else. When in fact, if you think on a sort of 2050 time horizon, we're just going to need it everywhere. So there's a debate about whether we can kind of put a lid on the demand we're ever going to need in order to avoid some of that infrastructure. And it's just not true. So telling a story about like the potential of really clean, cheap energy from renewables, we've just got to put that in front of people. And it feels really unintuitive to have that conversation at the moment when there's such big pressures because of the cost of living. But what's going on in the energy market is that gas prices are still setting the cost of a unit of what would otherwise be cheap renewables as well. And the faster we get off that dependency on gas on the system, as many on the call will know, the faster we move to a situation where like every unit of energy is cheaper. Gas is still setting the price of electricity in something like 97% of the time. So I think what the next Welsh government really needs to do is just kind of, I think, stop treating the dynamic between the development of commercial renewables and the development of community-led renewables as if that's a kind of irreconcilable conflict, rather than taking the approach from the policy perspective that anything you can do to kind of unlock commercial level developments is also going to be good for the community sector. And it'll also be good to speak in a little later about the role of the community sector in the heat transition specifically, but I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Andy. And points of contact with what some of the other contributors have already said. I mean, I was thinking about some of the stuff that you said, Henry, about the way in which government seeks to work in place with communities, precisely because there's a kind of asymmetry of knowledge and understanding about the scale of the challenge and the range of possible solutions and what it might look like in practice. Again, something that we hopefully can pick up in discussions. Naomi, I'm going to welcome you now to share some thoughts. So Naomi Mason is the head of Scotland at the Centre for Local Economic Strategies and brings over a decade of experience in delivering economic development across the public and third sectors. She has led CLES's work in Scotland, focusing on local economic strategies, natural resource ownership, public procurement, and renewable energy. She's also recovering from a chest infection, so if she mutes to cough, that is why. Over to you, Naomi.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for that. Bore da, or fit from where I'm from in Scotland. I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to rattle through this because 5 minutes really isn't that long. And I guess I want to follow up on a lot of what's been said already, but just really hone in on the fact that net zero, it really isn't just a technological shift. It is the possibility of local economic transformation. But whether that maximizes the opportunity or whether it deepens inequalities that already exist really depends on who owns the assets, who makes the decisions, and ultimately who's going to benefit. And bringing experience from Scotland and through CLES's wider work across the UK, we can see that having place-based, collaborative and inclusive approaches consistently secures some better outcomes for people and their communities. So I guess for Wales, one of my key questions is what strengths already exist in your local economies and how do you build on them? So in Scotland, we've used our engineering and offshore expertise. We've got a renewable industry that in 2022 supported over 47,000 jobs and generated 15.5 billion for the economy. Our public land and housing stock gives us a huge retrofit opportunity. Some could also see that as a challenge. We estimate that by 2028, we're going to need an additional 22,500 workers just to meet energy efficiency needs. We've got a strong community sector in Scotland. It's backed by legislation on empowerment and ownership, and that's enabled significant growth in community energy. By the end of 2023, Scotland had over 27,000 community and locally owned renewable energy installations. But there's significant challenges with the private capital dependent system that we operate in and a really constrained grid capacity north of the border, which are hampering new developments coming forward. So what can Wales learn? Well, I think Scotland can show that a devolved government can influence outcomes even without full legislative control. Our good practice principles encourage developers to contribute community benefit payments of 5,000 per megawatt. Between 1990 and 2022, that's brought more than 194 million into local communities, and research has shown that for every £1 invested, you get £4 back in local value. But that's uneven. The majority of developments take place near our most remote or sparsely populated places, which also have the highest rates of fuel poverty. And we know that shared and full ownership of resources produces better financial outcomes. And there is work underway at the moment in Scotland, which we're collaborating in to look at what a Scottish Community Wealth Fund might look like and asking a little bit more from renewable energy developers. We also have an onshore wind sector deal, which is a collaborative commitment between the public sector and the renewable sector to deliver 20 gig of onshore wind by 2030. But that includes reducing planning times, raising environmental standards and developing a sustainable supply chain. And at a local level, what we've seen and work that we've been part of, we worked with South of Scotland Enterprise to produce a community wealth building framework for renewable energies developers, which established a gold standard for approaching how long-term benefits can be embedded in the local economy. In the Highlands, we worked with Highland Council to support their creation of a social value charter, again, locking in additional community gains from the major renewable energy developments that are in planning. But all of that leads me to think about skills. And so often we talk about engineers, we talk about installers, we talk about technicians. And yeah, those skills are important. Of course they are, but they're only one part of what's needed. Our public sector is being hollowed out. And we really need local institutions with place-based economic development skills who can help to map supply chains, who can understand strengths and gaps, and who can design interventions that can help local businesses scale up to be part of the supply chain. We've seen councils in Scotland, so Orkney and North Ayrshire, are developing their own renewable energy assets, and that's enabling them to think about how they can finance themselves securely in the future, and that shows what's possible when capability is retained locally. Procurement and commercial skills are really important to ensure that we design contracts that give SMEs and social enterprises a real chance to participate and ensure that economic value doesn't leak away to distant shareholders but stays circulating locally. And communities, we've touched on them already. We need community-facing facilitation and capacity building skills. A successful net zero pathway has to require community participation and empowerment as part of it. And that means building trust, engaging communities meaningfully and supporting them to shape, develop and benefit from projects in their own area. And too often we end up working in silos, but net zero can only succeed if key anchor institutions work together around place-led pathways. And we did retrofit analysis in the south of Scotland to see what that could look like. The demand showed that there would be nearly 7,000 direct jobs, generating 340 million in GVA by 2045, just to meet the scale of demand across the housing associations. And that catalysed collaboration between colleges, councils, housing associations, and the third sector more generally to plan how to deliver the skills that are going to be required locally, retaining young people in the process and strengthening the local economy. And I know that previous research that Cles has been involved in with others has highlighted that green skills are already taught heavily in colleges in Wales, but many of these are funded through SPF. So what's going to happen as that changes form? So to wrap this up, I think a successful net zero transition is one that builds on local strands, retains local value, and is shaped by local communities and institutions. And the skills challenge isn't just technical, it has to be have consideration of institutional and relational needs. And from a Scottish perspective, there's lots that's not been successful, and I can pick up on some of that later. But our key lessons show that the transition can only succeed when it's powered by people, supportive of places, and designed to build long-term local wealth.
Thanks, Naomi. That's great. You've had a couple of nudges, audience, to add questions to the Q&A. Please continue to do so. I'm next going to turn to Joe, who's co-director at IWA. Joe, I wondered whether you could guide us through some of the questions, well, some of the questions you might have, but also some of the questions that are coming through from the audience.
Yeah, certainly. And from the IWA perspective, there's absolutely tons of different elements of this conversation that we could dig into. But one of the points that came to me from all of the interventions was that we know that Welsh Government has neither the budget nor all of the levers to do everything that it might want to promote, either growth or decarbonisation of the economy. And with that in mind, what should the priorities over the next Senedd term be? And Helen, I know you mentioned prioritising areas where impact is potentially largest. What are those? What should Welsh Government be prioritising? Because they don't have the resources to do all of this agenda at once, essentially. Open question to whoever wants to respond.
Helen, do you want to lead off? But others, if you want to put your hand up and come in. Thanks.
Sure, thanks, Joe. That's a really interesting question and really pertinent. I think I'd like to say something about the sectors of focus and then also a bit about the approach in response to that. But I think the key underlying message that's been coming out as well from that people have been saying is that the net zero transition is a real economic opportunity. So it's not just a climate obligation, and net zero isn't the opposite of economic growth. So I just really wanted to reiterate that. And it's the foundation for sustainable, resilient, long-term prosperity. But as Naomi's already mentioned, the way that it's done is key. And in terms of sectors, and I'll let others say more about the specifics of sectors. Infrastructure is a critical one in terms of energy infrastructure, as Andy was mentioning, and also transport infrastructure to support developing industries and to encourage inward investment. as well, also, and high value complex sectors. So having an industrial strategy that's forward looking and also responsive to the global economy, with an eye to responding to the needs of local areas. And I think that's a challenge in itself. But I'd like to say a bit more about the approach. So investment in innovation skills are really important for productivity, and having investment that's targeted, so where there's a clear, consistent narrative around the issues that are necessary for establishing consistent cross-sector government policies, and really engendering and taking the public along, so that it responds to the needs of the public, but also so it's not being inflicted upon anyone, and sending a clear message to potential investors as well. So place-based growth, reducing regional inequalities. I'm talking quite a lot, so there's a lot more I could say about this, but I'll stop and let others come in.
Thank you, Helen. Yeah, Ben, you had your hand up briefly. Do you want to comment on it as well?
Yeah, I think Helen mentioned already. I think infrastructure development is key, and particularly investment around this. I think for two reasons. One, it enables some of those kind of points that were made by the other panelists about community energy, for example, particularly when there's restrictions on infrastructure access, for example, and particularly when we go, I go from South Wales, I go to North Wales, we come into the Mid Wales area of Wales where infrastructure access is very limited. And I think that also restricts ability to join. But more importantly, I think we should also see our nature and our particular natural capital as an important piece of infrastructure, because we talked a lot about reaching net zero and climate mitigation. But I think we also need to think about climate adaptation as well. And I think we need to really see our natural kind of parks and national parks as a key piece of our infrastructure, to particularly to deal with the effects what we will see as a result of climate change. And I think that area is heavily underinvested in, and particularly with infrastructure investment being such a scale, I think it really generates ability, I think, to bring the kind of investment that's generally around the coastal areas, whether it's offshore or onshore, and the investments associated, which I showed on the map, and actually link that then to, I think, our climate adaptation program, which actually brings also prosperity in those rural areas, because I do think that that part is heavily underinvested, and it links to, I think, the question in the chat around rural communities and agriculture and the role that they play. But I think it's really important to think about how those national parks become key parts of a critical national infrastructure, and particularly the peatlands, but also the woodlands. They can retain a lot of water. And I think linking those infrastructure investments and the compensatory schemes that are needed to compensate for some of the nature lost in there, actually do that on a strategic basis, I think allows us to do much more with the same amount of money, and link those two strongly together. I think we haven't got that strategic approach yet in Wales, I think, about how we deal with climate change as well as with climate adaptation. And given our national capital, which we have, is a real kind of thing, we can do something really extraordinary in Wales like that. And Scotland have a similar kind of opportunity, I think. And I think it really sets us apart and provides some further empowerment, because there's a lot of investment that could be generated by institutional investors and others that are looking at de-risking, but also in the same time, I think we're trying to also tackle climate adaptation as well, and actually being more resilient from that perspective. So I think for me, I think that should be a real focus on how we do that strategically.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you. Well, I'll resist the urge to add something and add another question, because I can see two other panelists want to come in. What I will say, though, is that we need to get shorter in answering these questions, otherwise we're not going to get through all of enough of them. But sorry to do that to you, Andy. Hand over to you, Andy, with the be short, brief, but if you could.
Okay, I'll try. Want to kind of add to what Ben said by encouraging, as well as looking at it from a kind of top-down macro policy level, try and look at the kind of questions around skills through the eyes of like an individual, with an example from Nesta. So our mission is about heat pump rollout. It's a good, efficient technology which the Welsh government's own policies says that most homes in Wales are going to have a heat pump instead of a fossil fuel heating system. That means you need thousands more skilled installers over the coming decades. These are good, well-paid, non-tradable, foundational, whatever word you want to use, local jobs you're going to be installing and maintaining in your local area. They're good jobs for people in existing trades, whether you're an electrician, plumber, gas engineer, or people leaving colleges. So there's been a big debate around skills in retrofit, as Helen's mentioned, around like a bit of a chicken and egg. Do you need to put the supply chain in place and then skills will take care of itself, or do you invest in the skills alongside the supply chain? It's not really a kind of either or. I would tend to decide that they're not mutually exclusive. So I just want to talk about like something that we've done at Nesta, which is looking at that kind of how do you get somebody to choose to become a heat pump installer rather than a boiler installer? And that's not a kind of overnight transition. It's not something like one day you install boilers, the next day you just install heat pumps for the rest of your career. But we've kind of looked at that through engaging with the sorts of people, like the specific people who we think are best placed to make that career switch now, and try and understand like what does their journey actually look like? What's the journey from where they are to where we want them to be? What would give them confidence? What are their like pain points in the journey? What signals can you send? So as a government, obviously you can send quite a clear signal. If every boiler installer in Wales had read the Welsh Government's heat strategy, which I suspect that they haven't, then they would see in there that that's a very clear thing. You are going to much more likely to be installing heat pumps for the rest of your career rather than like hydrogen boilers, for example. But then even for people who've kind of made that decision, when we did lots of engagement with them, we found that one of the biggest pain points was actually just installing your first heat pump. Lots of reasons why that's tricky to do with how they're regulated. But we've then taken the step of setting up a scheme called Start at Home, which offers kind of upfront finance and zero interest loans to people to install a heat pump in their own home so that they have experience of doing it. They can then become an advocate and speak about it as someone who's actually living with that technology. And it makes it real for them and it makes it real for their customers, because we know that one of the first people who a householder turns to when they're thinking about getting a heat pump is a gas engineer. And if it's a gas engineer who's got no experience of heat pumps or believes some of the things that we might consider to be slightly misinformation about heat pumps, then the householders are going to get the wrong information. So by start looking at it through the eyes of the specific people who are best placed to make that transition to a green career, we've been able to come up with quite a novel solution to it. So as well as doing things like skills audits, it's really important to take it back down to the level of like, who do we actually think are the people who are going to do these jobs and what do they need? Hope that makes sense.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, it did. And I can, to just give the audience a peek behind the curtain, Henry's taken his hand down to allow time for more questions. So thank you, Henry, for that. And Naomi's also suggested that we could try and answer some of the questions that people have shared after the event in writing. So we're going to take up that idea. But Joe, over to you for another question.
Yeah, can speak to that. We've been inundated with really good questions, so I'll do my best to navigate us through some of them. Someone in the Q&A asked about potentially the term net zero not being farmer friendly, and asked, within the context of the just transition in Wales, how does the panel believe we can ensure that the move towards net zero supports all actors across the system rather than placing potentially additional burdens on them? Open question.
I wonder, Henry and Naomi, whether you want to come in on this one because you weren't able to on the last one. Henry.
I mean, it's a similar comment in a way, so that's a good question, and I'll try and be really brief. But I think the question here is what really are people's priorities, and how can government address those? Because if we're not addressing people's priorities, then that's a recipe for quite a few different problems. And I pointed to language in my comments earlier, and I think that's at the heart of this too. I think the challenge here is in a way for policymakers to be able to think of things together and not to try and say, well, here's our net zero target and here's our cost of living target and here's our farming target. It's all really one and the same thing, and it needs to focus on people's priorities. So making sure that climate action, net zero action on nature is delivered as part of delivering people's priorities, I think is what some of the the points I made earlier on language and collaboration really highlight. So yeah, those collaborative and partnership skills are then really critical for policymakers. But it is a challenge for policymakers ultimately. How can we conceive of it all together and try and address those priorities?
Thanks, Henry. Naomi.
I would just echo that entirely and say, again, coming back to what I said, it's about moving away from silo working. It's really about moving into a place-based focus and who are the place-based actors in a local economy. And that is everybody from farmers to bakers to, the large renewable energy developers. So they all need to be part of a place-based way of thinking and a way of coming together to really understand their local economy and support it, drive it, and ultimately sustain it.
Thank you. Joe, do you think we've got time for one more quick one?
Yeah, I think so. So we've had a couple that speak to similar things, but I'll choose Simon Slater from Cynnal Cymru. How do we strengthen local economic development capacity to lead/deliver this agenda? And someone else has asked about corporate joint committee's role within that as well. Where's the capacity and resource?
Anybody want to share quick thoughts on that? Those two linked questions.
I'm more than happy just to quickly comment. I think for me, it's about having a clear strategy and also then a deployment strategy around that, learning from my business experience. I think we have limited amount of resources that's already been made. And I think what's really important, that comes also through the cluster plan work, is that we don't see it as a national problem, but actually we translate the kind of national targets down to very specific prioritized targets within the CJCs and even into local communities. And I think it's that clear translation about from national into those local areas where a clear kind of role is being described for them. And I think the Wellbeing Future Generations Act, particularly with those five kind of goals, I think is really important to find a balanced scorecard and think work collaboratively with communities on what is our role within that space. And I think we spend too little time to date on actually having those conversations about how can we actually make that happen in our local community. What's the role of industry? What's the role of kind of communities? What's the role of agriculture in that kind of space? And I think we've been not very good in articulating that. And I think citizens assemblies and those kind of things can really help and play that kind of part. But I think we need to start thinking about how we translate the top down and then prioritize those limited resources we have to deliver the biggest impact parts or what people find most important.
Thanks, Ben. I'm sorry, Henry. I can see that you were also thinking of coming in on this. We are out of time, and so we need to end it there. But thank you very much to all of our panelists. Thanks to the IWA as kind of co-hosts alongside WCPP. We will be, as I said, we've recorded this and we'll be sharing the recording. I am taken with Naomi's idea that we collate some of the questions that we got and try and answer them in writing. So there's a link in there's various links in the webinar chat. But if you're keen to see those mail outs, one way of doing that would be to sign up to the newsletter, and we will collate all of this information and package it up and share it with you. But thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and particular thanks to our panelists.